The oppressive August of 1836 settled over South Carolina's colonial coast, with a humidity so thick it seemed to transform the air itself into something tangible and suffocating. The heat radiating from Charleston's cobblestones and from the rice fields that stretched for miles along the coastal waterways, creating conditions that made even breathing feel like labor and that drove white families to their summer retreats, while enslaved workers continued the brutal routines that sustained the region's extraordinary wealth, regardless of temperatures that killed the unprepared and the unlucky with terrifying regularity. In the slave quarters of Magnolia Grove Plantation, situated along one of the tidal creeks that connected the interior rice fields to Charleston Harbor and the Atlantic beyond, field workers gathered in the evening darkness and spoke in voices that carried both profound skepticism, born from decades of bitter experience, and something that might have been the most tentative whisper of cautious hope about an extraordinary purchase that had been completed 3 weeks earlier at the Charleston slave market. According to local legend, what had transpired that July morning defied every pattern they had observed across years of watching how the Low Country's planter aristocracy made decisions about acquiring the human property that sustained their operations, suggesting possibilities that seemed too improbable to believe, yet too specific in their details, and too consistent in their telling across multiple witnesses to dismiss entirely as mere wishful fantasy, constructed to make unbearable circumstances slightly more tolerable through dreams of deliverance that cruel reality would inevitably destroy. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 13 months would become a story whispered not merely as another chronicle of suffering passively endured, but as compelling evidence that even within South Carolina's Low Country, where slavery existed in perhaps its most brutal and comprehensive form in all of North America, where rice cultivation killed enslaved workers at rates that required constant importation of new labor to replace those destroyed by disease and overwork, and where surveillance and control had been refined across generations to address the persistent reality that Black people outnumbered whites in many coastal districts by ratios that created constant anxieties about potential uprisings, unexpected alliances could nevertheless form between people whom every social convention and legal structure insisted must remain forever separated by unbridgeable chasms, creating possibilities for resistance and liberation that demonstrated the institution's fundamental vulnerability when moral conviction combined with strategic intelligence and the kind of sustained courage that understood both the enormous risks involved in such defiance and the even greater moral costs of remaining passively complicit in a system whose evil became more undeniable with every day of proximity to its brutal daily operations. South Carolina's colonial coast in the mid-1830s represented American slavery in perhaps its most extreme and deadly manifestation, a region where vast fortunes had been accumulated through rice cultivation that required such intensive and dangerous labor that it killed workers at rates exceeding even the notorious sugar plantations of Louisiana and the Caribbean, where elaborate irrigation systems demanded constant maintenance, performed while standing in water infested with malaria, carrying mosquitoes and venomous snakes, where summer heat combined with swamp miasmas to create disease environments so deadly that white planter families fled to Charleston or to northern resorts for months each year, while enslaved people continued working in conditions that guaranteed significant portions of the workforce would not survive to see another harvest season. The region's economy depended almost entirely on rice production that generated extraordinary profits for planter families who constituted one of the wealthiest elites in North America, aristocrats who built elaborate townhouses in Charleston and who cultivated social pretensions that rivaled anything the Tidewater aristocracy could claim, yet whose fortunes rested upon systematic mass death that required constant replacement of workers through the domestic slave trade once the international trade had been legally prohibited after 1808. Charleston had become the commercial and cultural capital of this wealth, built quite literally on mountains of human corpses. A glittering city where planters constructed mansions that showcased their refined tastes, and where social seasons operated according to rhythms designed to allow them to escape the deadly summer months when malaria ravaged the rice districts with particular ferocity. The city's slave market operated with a volume and brutality that shocked even visitors accustomed to slavery's operations in other regions, with thousands of people bought and sold annually in transactions that generated enormous revenues for traders, auctioneers, and the city government that collected substantial taxes and licensing fees from commerce and human beings. The market functioned with rituals refined across generations to reduce complex human lives to simple commercial transactions, with auctioneers cataloging physical capabilities and estimated years of productive labor in language that deliberately obscured the moral horror of treating people as fungible property, whose value could be calculated through mathematical formulas that assigned dollar amounts to human muscles and bones, while making no acknowledgement whatsoever of the consciousness and suffering and humanity of those being bought and sold like livestock or agricultural equipment. The legal structures governing South Carolina slavery in 1836 were among the harshest and most comprehensive in the United States, reflecting the colony's and later states' history of maintaining a black majority population that created persistent fears about potential uprisings, and that demanded systematic mechanisms of control that left nothing to chance, and that attempted to eliminate every possible avenue for autonomous action or organized resistance. The slave code forbade enslaved people from learning to read under penalty of brutal physical punishment, prohibited gathering without white supervision in ways that made even religious services subject to surveillance, restricted movement so thoroughly that travel beyond immediate plantation boundaries required written passes that patrols could demand to examine at any moment, and created comprehensive frameworks of control, backed by both legal authority and organized violence through militia and patrol systems that operated with essentially unlimited power to interrogate, detain, and punish any black person whose presence or behavior raised even the slightest suspicion. Free black people existed in Charleston and occasionally in rural areas, but under restrictions so severe that their status remained perpetually precarious and subject to challenge, requiring constant documentation and white patronage to avoid re-enslavement through legal mechanisms that made even legally free people vulnerable to being claimed as property if they could not produce ironclad proof of their status. Into this world of systematic brutality operating on industrial scales, of comprehensive legal controls backed by organized violence, of extraordinary wealth built upon mass death that planters worked assiduously to conceal behind facades of aristocratic refinement and paternalistic care, came two people whose encounter would reveal that even apparently stable marriages within the Low Country's most established planter families could conceal profound disagreements about the fundamental morality of the system that sustained their households, and that such disagreements could manifest in actions that violated every expectation about how white women from South Carolina's planter aristocracy were supposed to relate to the enslaved people whose suffering and death made their privileged existence materially possible. Stories passed down through generations claim that the July morning in 1836, when Richard and Louisa Beaufort attended the Charleston slave market, began with a conversation that had been recurring with mounting frequency and increasing emotional intensity over recent months. A discussion about Magnolia Grove's labor requirements, and the decisions that the previous year's devastating malaria outbreak seemed to require if the plantation was to maintain its rice production at levels that would sustain the family's accustomed standard of living and their position within Charleston's planter elite. Richard had concluded that the estate's operations demanded purchasing multiple replacement workers to compensate for the 15 people who had died during the previous summer's particularly severe malaria season, acquisitions that would require substantial capital expenditure, but that he considered absolutely necessary if Magnolia Grove was to maintain its position as one of the region's more productive rice operations. He had come to Charleston that morning intending to purchase strong young workers who could provide years of productive labor before the brutal conditions destroyed them, as they inevitably would, making calculations about expected years of service and productive capacity that treated human beings as equipment with predictable depreciation schedules. But Louisa had accompanied him despite his suggestion that she remain at their Charleston townhouse, and her presence would transform the day's events in ways that neither could have anticipated, and that would permanently alter their marriage and their relationship to the institution that had sustained both their families across multiple generations. According to oral histories preserved with remarkable consistency across generations, among networks that assisted fugitives and among enslaved communities that maintained careful unofficial records of events that official documentation systematically excluded, the morning's transactions proceeded according to Richard's plans through the initial stages, with him successfully purchasing 4 field workers, young people in their late teens and early 20s, whose physical condition suggested they might survive the rice fields for 5 or perhaps even 10 years if they possessed unusual constitution, and if malaria and the countless other hazards of low-country rice cultivation didn't kill them prematurely as such conditions killed so many others. But when the auctioneer brought a man named Darren to the block, 7 feet and 5 inches tall, with a physique suggesting tremendous physical strength but also carrying visible evidence of brutal treatment by previous owners, described by the auctioneer as someone who had been sold twice in 3 years because owners found him unsuited to proper discipline, despite his obvious capacity for the heaviest labor that rice cultivation required. Something shifted in the dynamic between Richard and Louisa that would alter not just that day's transactions, but the fundamental trajectory of their lives together. Louisa had watched the morning's earlier purchases with discomfort that Richard had noticed but attributed to feminine sensibility about the market's brutal atmosphere. Though he had also felt some irritation that she had insisted on accompanying him when he had suggested she avoid exposure to scenes that he recognized were unpleasant, even as he considered them economically necessary. But when she saw Darren standing on that platform, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions that barely concealed brutal treatment behind euphemisms about management difficulties and resistance to proper authority, when she observed the intelligence and unbroken dignity in his bearing, despite the degrading circumstances and the visible scars that testified to attempts to break his spirit, Louisa made a decision that years of apparently harmonious marriage within one of the Low Country's most distinguished families had given no indication she possessed the capacity or courage to make. She turned to Richard and told him in a voice that carried an authority he had never heard from her regarding any matter related to plantation operations or the management of enslaved workers that they would purchase this man, that regardless of whatever other acquisitions he intended to make that day, this particular purchase was one she was insisting upon with an intensity that communicated her demand was absolutely non-negotiable. Richard's response combined shock at what he perceived as his wife's unprecedented interference in decisions that were properly and exclusively his domain as master of Magnolia Grove, mounting anger at what seemed like deliberate undermining of the careful economic calculations he had made about the plantation's labor requirements, and genuine bewilderment about what she could possibly hope to accomplish by insisting on purchasing someone whose history suggested he would create exactly the kind of management problems that efficient rice operations absolutely could not tolerate. He told her that the suggestion made no economic sense, that rice cultivation required workers who would submit to the brutal discipline that productivity demanded, that purchasing someone described as resistant to proper authority would create operational problems that would require either selling him at a loss or subjecting him to escalating violence that might ultimately destroy expensive property without achieving the subordination that made such investments worthwhile. But Louisa's insistence was unyielding in ways that transcended mere disagreement to communicate that she was acting on convictions she considered more fundamental than his authority, their economic interests, or even the stability of their marriage that such defiance might permanently damage. She told him that if he would not bid, she would use inheritance from her family that South Carolina law gave her limited control over to make the purchase independently, that this was a line she was drawing about what she would tolerate happening in her name. She made clear she recognized the economic irrationality of her demand and the management complications it might create, but that there were moral considerations that she could no longer ignore, regardless of the consequences such adherence to conscience might create. Faced with what amounted to an ultimatum delivered in tones that suggested profound conviction rather than temporary sentiment, and aware that other Low Country planters were observing this unprecedented public disagreement between husband and wife over matters that every convention decreed belonged exclusively to male authority, Richard bid on Darren with mounting resentment but also with wary recognition that his wife of 16 years was revealing aspects of her character that their marriage had somehow never fully exposed. He competed against 2 other bidders and finally secured Darren for $1,800, a substantial sum for someone whose history suggested he might prove commercially problematic. As they completed the purchase and arranged for Darren to be transported to Magnolia Grove, Richard demanded explanations for behavior he found both incomprehensible and threatening to his understanding of their household's functioning. But Louisa declined to provide details that would satisfy his questions, speaking instead about moral obligations and divine judgment in language so general, it seemed deliberately designed to avoid revealing whatever specific purposes motivated her unprecedented insistence. What Richard did not know, what Louisa's extraordinarily careful discretion across years had successfully concealed, was that his wife had been conducting a quiet but increasingly comprehensive campaign of resistance against slavery's brutalities that manifested in ways he never noticed, because he assumed her household management reflected conventional motivations rather than moral convictions that would have alarmed him profoundly. Louisa had grown up in a Charleston family whose Presbyterian faith emphasized themes of divine justice and human accountability in ways that created internal tensions with slaveholding that some individuals found increasingly difficult to maintain. and she had inherited from her mother a conviction that slavery violated fundamental Christian principles, even as social realities made open opposition seem impossible for families whose entire existence depended on the institution. When she married Richard and became mistress of Magnolia Grove, Louisa had initially hoped she might influence him toward more humane treatment, that proximity might soften whatever justifications allowed him to maintain the system with apparent moral comfort. But she had gradually recognized that Richard's commitment to slavery transcended economic interest to reflect deeply internalized beliefs about racial hierarchy that made him unable to see enslaved people as fully human in morally significant ways. This painful recognition had led Louisa to begin taking covert actions, using her authority over household operations to create small spaces of relative safety that mitigated slavery's worst effects without directly challenging Richard's ultimate control. She taught household servants to read, despite laws forbidding literacy, and despite severe punishments both teacher and students would face if discovered. She maintained careful contacts with the small network of Quakers and other anti-slavery sympathizers who operated clandestinely in Charleston, people who took extraordinary risks to assist those seeking freedom. Most significantly, Louisa had been systematically learning about escape routes and networks that helped fugitives despite enormous legal dangers. Accumulating knowledge she had no immediate plan to use, but recognized might prove crucial if circumstances created opportunities to help someone reach freedom. When she saw Darren on that auction block, when she heard descriptions of his repeated resistance, when she observed the unbroken intelligence in his bearing, Louisa recognized someone marked for eventual destruction through escalating violence or sale to even worse conditions. In that moment, she made a decision she had been moving toward for years, that she would use whatever resources her position provided to help this man not just survive, but escape to freedom. Regardless of profound risks to her security, and regardless of how Richard would react if he discovered the truth. Darren arrived at Magnolia Grove on a July evening when summer heat had reached levels that made even minimal exertion dangerous, and when the plantation's rhythms were governed entirely by the brutal demands of rice cultivation that continued regardless of temperatures that killed the unprepared. Richard assigned Darren immediately to the hardest work available, clearing new irrigation ditches while standing in water under direct sun, moving massive timbers through swamps where every step risked injury, performing labor designed to break spirits and establish absolute subordination through exhaustion and suffering. But what Richard did not observe was that Louisa began finding ways to communicate with Darren that appeared routine, but served concealed purposes. She would bring additional food and water to field workers during the hottest hours, a practice Richard viewed as prudent property maintenance, but that gave Louisa brief opportunities to speak with Darren in contexts where conversations could be disguised. She arranged for him to perform occasional maintenance tasks near the main house, work his strength suited, but that also created opportunities for slightly longer exchanges. Most crucially, she ensured he had responsibilities requiring travel to Charleston or neighboring plantations, journeys that gave him knowledge of waterways and roads that could prove essential for escape. Through these carefully orchestrated interactions, Louisa communicated information that Darren received with profound wariness. She told him she opposed slavery morally, despite her position, that she maintained contacts who could assist those seeking freedom, that she would help him escape when circumstances permitted. Darren listened skeptically, understanding white people's capacity for betrayal, but also recognizing this might be his only chance, and that excessive caution could itself be a trap that kept people enslaved when freedom was achievable through calculated risk. The late summer and fall of 1836 brought careful mutual assessment. Louisa worked to prove her assistance was genuine while Darren tested her claims through small acts that could reveal whether she would report resistance. She began providing specific information about routes north through waterways toward free black communities along the coast, and eventually to northern states, sharing knowledge about patrol patterns and surveillance that could help avoid detection. She gave him access to maps and materials that helped him understand the geography between the low country and free territory, resources her education allowed her to possess, but that would mean severe punishment for any enslaved person discovered with them. Most significantly, Louisa accumulated concrete resources necessary for escape, food for extended travel, clothing suitable for varied conditions, and most crucially, forged papers identifying Darren as a free black waterman named David Brown, traveling on legitimate business. Documents she obtained through Charleston contacts who took extraordinary risks. Darren, observing these preparations while continuing to test her sincerity, gradually came to believe her assistance was authentic and represented genuine possibilities despite formidable obstacles. By late winter of 1837, preparations that Louisa and Darren had maintained for months moved toward implementation as circumstances created opportunity. Richard needed to travel to Columbia for extended legislative business, sessions that would keep him away for at least 3 weeks, and leave Louisa in practical control of plantation operations. She communicated through established methods that Darren should prepare to attempt escape during this window, that she would create conditions necessary for departure, but timing would depend on variables they couldn't completely control. The plan involved Darren leaving on what would appear a routine errand to Charleston to collect supplies, a task he had performed before. But instead of returning to Magnolia Grove, he would continue using waterways north, carrying forged papers and money Louisa provided, relying on networks she had connected him to for assistance at critical points. The opportunity came in March 1837, during the second week after Richard's departure, when weather seemed favorable for water travel before spring storms made passage more dangerous. Louisa sent Darren to Charleston with supplies to purchase and a boat ostensibly needed to transport materials back. But she also provided forged papers identifying him as David Brown, money sufficient for weeks of travel, and detailed instructions about contacts in Charleston and along the coast who could provide further assistance. Their final conversation, preserved in oral traditions, acknowledged both his gratitude for unexpected assistance and recognition that she was taking extraordinary risks that could destroy her life if discovered. Darren left Magnolia Grove on a March morning when early spring was beginning to transform the landscape. He traveled to Charleston as instructed, made purchases establishing legitimate business appearance, then quietly met with contacts Louisa had arranged who provided additional resources before he began his journey north along coastal waterways. Using forged papers and his knowledge of maritime navigation, gained from rice plantation work. The journey from the Low Country to Free Territory required weeks of extraordinarily careful travel through landscapes where slave patrols operated, and where any black person without ironclad documentation faced immediate arrest. According to accounts preserved by networks that assisted fugitives, Darren successfully navigated these challenges through combination of Louisa's preparation, his own intelligence and resourcefulness, and assistance from dozens who took enormous risks to help. By May 1837, Darren had reached Pennsylvania and was making his way toward Philadelphia, where established free black communities could provide support for establishing new identity as David Brown and finding employment. What happened in subsequent years remains largely undocumented as survival required discretion, though some accounts suggest he eventually went to Canada for greater security, while others claim he remained in Pennsylvania and participated in assisting other fugitives. Back at Magnolia Grove, Louisa managed aftermath with carefully prepared performance, expressing surprise when Darren failed to return from Charleston and suggesting explanations ranging from accident to simple flight. When Richard returned to discover the acquisition his wife had insisted upon had vanished, his anger combined multiple elements: financial loss, bewilderment about her original insistence, and discomfort that his absence had enabled escape. He organized searches and offered rewards, contacted slave catchers, and placed advertisements describing Darren's height. But the trail had gone cold completely. Whether Richard ever suspected Louisa's role remains uncertain. If doubts emerged, he never voiced them in ways creating documented confrontations. Perhaps because accusing his wife would require acknowledging possibilities that would fundamentally destabilize their marriage. Louisa maintained careful discretion for the remainder of her life. Understanding revelation could endanger both herself and others in networks that continued assisting fugitives. The financial loss combined with other pressures eventually forced Richard to make adjustments to Magnolia Grove's operations, though whether these reflected purely economic necessity or any shifts in his thinking remains unclear. The impact rippled through enslaved communities in ways official records never captured, but oral traditions preserved as evidence that freedom remained achievable even from the Low Country's brutal slavery. For enslaved people throughout the region, the story of someone so distinctive successfully escaping from one of the coast's major rice plantations became proof that careful planning with unexpected assistance could overcome even the most comprehensive surveillance. And sometimes, according to legends communities preserved, that resistance stood 7 feet 5 inches tall, purchased at a wife's insistence not to be exploited but to be saved, assisted by a planter's wife whose moral convictions led her to violate every expectation and whose strategic courage created possibilities the system insisted could never exist. Darren's journey from Charleston's auction block to Pennsylvania freedom lasted barely 8 months. But his story became enduring proof that freedom was achievable even from circumstances that seemed most hopeless. That moral conviction could lead people to risk everything to help others escape bondage, and that human dignity could never be completely suppressed regardless of how brutal or comprehensive the apparatus of oppression.